So, how's everybody's Father's Day weekend going?
I don't know, I'm not a father.
You don't have to be the father to participate in Father's Day weekend. You get your dads any gifts or anything?
I made
Yeah? What'd you make him?
a structure.
It's probably what your dad wanted, not gonna lie.
A structure.
Have you seen it?
What do you mean you made him a structure?
Let me show you.
Like, is this like
Thing on
popsicle
your
sticks and Elmer's
dresser?
glue or what?
I got him a fishing shirt and a fishing hat.
Always good options.
And I made him breakfast
Ooh,
at
there you
like
go.
9 o'clock.
That's like a normal time to have breakfast. Why'd you say that?
No, because we
Like
had
at
to go to
9
church.
o'clock. PM?
No.
This is the structure that I made.
Oh, so it's like a sculpture, not a structure.
Oh, wow. That's
What
beautiful.
is it made out of? Paper? Yeah, paper mache.
And where did you put it? On his shelf?
No, I gave it to
So you should have been up here giving me art class for the skit. Okay, got it, yeah. Awesome.
Oh, that's interesting.
Alright, we've got a couple more skits coming up, games and fun stuff like that. So we're going through the questions series, okay, and essentially we're taking different topics, addressing them scripturally and kind of what the Bible has to say, or just from a Christian worldview. Last week we talked about, is there a God? We did have some references to Scripture and stuff like that. We really didn't dig deep into Scripture. This week I'm answering the question that everyone kind of always asks, and that's creation versus evolution. So first off, let me just say that my goal today is not to prove that you have to be a creationist, meaning that God created, in order to be a Christian, okay? Or even to prove that young earth creationism, which is meaning that God created in the literal 6 days, 7th day he rested, and that was about 6,000 years ago-ish, or something like that. Like, my goal is not even to prove that right. Essentially, what I want to do today is just talk about evolution and its theory, and kind of what that means. So, for example, have you ever heard the full name of the book by Charles Darwin in 1869?
I passed, but I don't remember.
It's called The Theory of Evolution and the Origin of Species
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and of Lesser Races.
I don't remember.
Oh yeah, that one always gets cut out. So, essentially the book was a racist book. It was written in the mid-1800s whenever they were trying to support why certain races were superior to other races. And so one of the things that he wanted to prove was why whites were superior to all the other races. And this is actually one of the top quoted books in Mein Kampf. Yep, so you can go look up some of that. So, what I want to talk about is essentially the theory of evolution. Is it a viable theory based on some of the evidence that's out there? Because here's the thing, like, we all have the same evidence. Like, no one has different fossils. Like, it's not like the creationists and the evolutionists are looking at different fossils. They're all the same fossils, right? So, essentially, I need to explain a bit of math so that the next of what's coming makes sense. All right, so here we go. All right, every time you have a set of 3 zeros, it goes to the next number, right? Hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. After we get to trillions, it gets to quadrillions, then quintillions, septillions, on and on and on. There gets to be a point where there's no longer words for the numbers. So then they start doing a 10 to a power, okay? So when they start doing 10 to the negative whatever power, that means point however many zeros is that power. So if it's 10 to the negative 24, that means 24 zeros, 1. Dot, 24 zeros, 1. Does that make sense? Or 1, if it's in the positive, 1, however many zeros after that, okay? Just so we understand, because we're going to run into a lot of issues with their theory of evolution. So, first let me remind you about the second law of thermodynamics. What's up? There you go. So, last week I shared with you the fancy word entropy. All matter tends towards entropy. That's the second law of thermodynamics, meaning chaos. So, we use the example of my watch. If we just put all the pieces into the box and shook it all up, is the watch going to come out? Of course not. It's going to come out as dust. Okay? Why? Because things don't naturally assemble themselves. They decay, they fall apart, right? So that's the first reason why evolution really tends to fall apart, especially cosmic evolution. Second reason is, or some other reasons would be, this one's from Henry Morris. And so he says, let's say every couple throughout all of history has had 2.1 to 2.5 children per family. So it's like 2 parents, 2 kids, right? 2 parents, 2 kids. If we had 2 parents and 2 kids in every family, the number would never change, right? We would have the exact same number going from one generation to the next generation. However, how many of you are more than 2? Okay, yeah, so obviously people are doing that, but let's just say it's 2.1. So for every 10 people, there's a third kid, okay, or something like that. All right, so that means then, if humanity is really 1 million years old, just 1 million years old, that means there should be 3.7 times 10 to the 2091st power people. That means 3.7, so if we get rid of the point, 37, 2091 zeros following after it. That's how many people should be on the planet. We only have 7 billion. We say only, but in that kind of number, we can still put names to that number. We can't even comprehend what that kind of number would look like if humanity was only 1 million years old. Does that make sense? So, just simply by the fact that there's not that many years of us, that many of us, we're not that old of a race. So, let's also talk about the shrinking sun. This is by John Eddy from Harvard University. The Earth is apparently 4.3 billion years old, FYI. The sun shrinks at 5 feet per year. That's 0.1% each century. So that means at the end of this year, the sun will be 5 feet smaller than what it was last year. On and on and on. If that was the case, okay, 20 million years ago, the Earth, in order to be its current size, would be touching the sun, or touching the Earth. So if the Earth was touching the sun, there would be no Earth, right? So how did the Earth get here if it's even 20 million, not 4.3 billion? So just by the fact that we have a sun at this current size, having an Earth it makes no sense. It's not possible. Based on the Earth's age, not the sun's age, the Earth's age. Now, let's talk about some more fun stuff that I really enjoy. All right, so let's talk about fossils, okay? So there are fossils where the sand hardened immediately and turned into ripples. Do I have an image behind me? Oh, good. All right, so how many of you guys have seen some kind of image like this in some science book? All right, okay. Or maybe you've gone, anybody to Grand Canyon? Anybody? Good, me neither, otherwise I'd be jealous of you. All right, so I really want to go. So the concept is, over millions of years, more sediment gets laid down, so the deeper we dig, the farther back in time we see, right? So that's why we have fish, and we have these animals, and we have apes. And so the higher we go, the more complex the organisms get. The lower we go, the less complex organisms get. They teach this, they've been teaching this for years and years and years. So we go all the way down to the very bottom, and we should start seeing no fossils. So then we go to the year we find fossils, that first layer. Okay, that's when life began on Earth. Makes sense, right? Because anything below that means no life. All right, so one of the farthest ones we find back is like the Nautilus and the Trilobite. Okay, which is like the shell thing imprint in the rock. All right, now what's not there in the fossil?
The animal.
The animal. Nautilus, the Trilobite, none of those are there. What is there? The impression in the rock of the fossil. Fossil's not there anymore, okay? But they're going to refer to that as an index fossil. An index fossil means, okay, anytime we find this fossil in the rock, that means this rock is X amount of years ago, because we know that this animal lived X amount of years ago. Make sense? So they're dating the rock by the fossil. What's not there?
The fossil.
Fossil. The animal. The animal's not there, but they're dating the rock by the animal that's not there. So how do they date the animal? With the rock. Yeah, I saw your faces go like, wait a minute. Yeah, they date the rock with the animal, and the animal that's not there with the rock. Yeah, dating the fossil by the rock. The fossil dates the rock dates the fossil. Sounds a little bit of circular reasoning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a problem there. Also, because the fossil's not there, they have to use what's called radiometric dating. All right, so you all heard of this one yet?
With the little cells and everything.
Not cells. It's they choose a radioactive isotope. So in this case, we'll just talk about carbon-14. So in all organic matter, there is carbon-14. Now, carbon's natural number is 12. Okay, so an isotope means that there's X amount of electrons beyond the normal 12. So 14 instead of 12. So what happens when you die is slowly in organisms, carbon-14 decays to carbon-12, and it takes a long time. And based upon that amount of decay, they can measure about how long ago this organism lived. Makes sense, right? Except for one problem, we don't really know that the decay rate of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is been consistent. We're not sure of that. We don't know that if it's always decayed at the same rate. Second, we don't know how much carbon-14 was there to begin with. They assumed it was full, like it was 100% carbon-14, and now, because there's carbon-12, but that would mean there's no carbon-12 in living organisms, but there is. So there's problems there. So let me explain an event that occurred in 1980. Mount St. Helens. I wasn't there, you weren't there. If some of our volunteers were here, they could maybe tell you about it, I don't know, but I wasn't there. In 1980, there was a giant mountain called Mount St. Helens. It was actually a volcano in Washington State. When it blew, the whole top half of the mountain just blew up. And ash and lava and all that stuff came down and created like giant pools that then hardened into various rocks, obsidian, stuff like that. They dated those rocks to millions of years old.
What?
Yep. Happened in 1980. We have video footage of it. But it's millions of years old. So that just kind of proves to me like maybe the radiometric dating is not as accurate as we like to suggest.
Wasn't it made just then?
Yeah, like
Yes.
people watched it. Pardon me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, if humanity's not that long, like it's not been around that long, stuff like that shouldn't be able to happen. So let me tell you about some of the other issues we have. So have you ever been to the beach and you've seen the sand and it seems like there's ripples in the sand from the waves pushing it up and down? Okay. Now later you come by and those ripples are gone, right? Because a wave came by, washed it away, the wind blew it away because it dried out, something like that, right? We have fossils with ripples in it. So the rock has ripples in the rock, fossilized. The only way that would be possible is if immediately another layer of sediment covered it. Like preserved it so that the ripples couldn't go away. Put pressure on it and it fossilized. So think about Grand Canyon, something like that. That's where you get all the different layers. So the old statement, I don't think they're teaching this in school anymore, but the old statement is that over millions of years, this sediment layer would get laid down. That's why you have animals from this particular time would be here. Okay, then when something happened and now you've got a new sediment layer that laid these layers down, stuff like that. Okay, no. Well, the problem with that is that doesn't work because in order for this to happen, it would all have to be dropped at the exact same amount of time. So if you would like to do this experiment at home just for fun and giggles, go home, just grab like a handful of like dirt that has like maybe some stone in it, rock in it, all this different material. Put it in like a mason jar, maybe halfway full. Fill the rest of it up with water. Get yourself a stick. High-tech science right here. Stir it up until it's nice and smooth. Take the stick out, stick it on a counter, come back a couple hours, and you're going to notice layers. Heavier stuff falls faster, so it's at the bottom. Then lighter, then lighter, then lighter, then lighter. In order for layers to work, it requires water to drop it all into place. Now you guys remember this, but Hurricane Katrina, this actually happened. It came in, hit Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, that area. It hit a bunch of houses. The storm surge came in and then took the houses out with it. And then out in the Gulf, they found the debris. And they found layers. Heavier stuff at the bottom, lighter stuff, lighter stuff, lighter stuff. They took core samples of it. They measured it all out. A couple years later, they came back because they wanted to see what had happened to all the layers. What do you think happened? They were gone. What happened? They got mixed up. by creatures, animals, worms, stuff like that. It's called bioturbation. It's a natural process. So, if these layers were on the surface, slowly being laid down, that's impossible, because something would have churned it up. In order for it to be layers, that means it had to be buried immediately by water, deep. Now, we have massive layers of rock. So that would require massive amounts of water. That would be called a flood. And we got a story about one of those, right? Yeah, Genesis 6, Noah, the flood. Okay, so they now call it flood geology. It's an actual type of geology, and it requires floods in order to make these layers. The problem they have, though, is they do not affirm a global flood. If they affirmed a global flood, that would kind of make us look right. So they're all regionalized, compartmentalized, local floods that happened at different times, except for there are sediment layers that span continents. There are sediment layers that come from other areas of the world that got washed around. How? Because it was a global flood. Make sense? The other thing it should teach is that, all right, again, the further down you go, the simpler the fossils get. What if you have a fossil that goes through multiple layers? Is that possible? Of course it is. Let's see the next slide with polystrate fossils. That and that and that looks like it's a tree.
That's cool.
They're called polystrate fossils. In other words, they go through multiple layers of strata. This is a fossil. It was a tree at some point. But then it got buried. You can actually go to Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. There's a whole forest of these things where you can now see these things just everywhere. So again, remember, millions of years to layer, that's not possible because then you'd have exposed wood. What happens to exposed wood? It rots, it decomposes, it falls apart. All right, so the only way for this to even be possible is if all of this covered this immediately, right? So that means then that this was laid immediately, not over thousands of years, which means then you should actually find items all throughout the different layers. And we do.
So
You find fossils in all the different layers. I'm not saying that Christianity is necessarily right at this point. I'm not even getting into that. I'm just saying that the theory of evolution is not looking very good. So, polystrate fossils had to be done immediately and quickly. So one of the things that we know about them, these polystrate fossils, miners used to call them kettles because they knew that these massive rock cylinders, as you were mining through the layers to find whatever, if you knocked it loose, it would fall and crush you like a pillar. So this is not just like a simple thing, like these are found everywhere, okay? So, now, what's my next slide? These are the giraffes. No, oh, that's right, I gotta go back to this one. Okay, so this is another issue. What do you see there?
Footprints.
What kind of footprints?
Big.
Big ones. Dinosaurs. This is actually, let me get my notes so I can actually tell you the right exact location. We'll find it. Okay, here it is. It's called the Paluxy River in Glen Rose, Texas, the Taylor Trail. That's what it's called because a guy named Taylor discovered it. It's in the middle of Dinosaur Valley State Park in Texas, so you can actually go see this if you want to. There are 134 dinosaur prints on this layer. We're just looking at a small cross section. 134 dinosaur prints. Now remember, again, the ripple thing. All right, once you put an impression in, that means it immediately had to get covered in order to preserve it. Right, so it didn't over thousands of years happen. We also have 14 human footprints. Now, how would that happen if they didn't coexist? So here's the theory by the evolutionists. So at one point when the dinosaurs walked through there, it was soft, but then it fossilized. But then it became exposed again, somebody walked through it, and then fossilized again.
What's your theory?
They lived at the same time.
they put in.
That's a much simpler theory, isn't it? And there's actually another image. I couldn't find the image, but I've seen it, where there's a dinosaur footprint and a human footprint right in the middle of the dinosaur footprint. Only way that's possible for that fossil to even exist is that it got buried by sediment all at the exact same
But
time.
now how is it exposed?
Oh, they dug it up. See, like here's dirt and stuff. They
Oh.
slowly, like guy with shovel. Okay, like they've slowly been revealing it because someone discovered the footprints in the Dinosaur Valley State Park. Okay.
So does that mean like they like put down the footprints? Like
It means either the dinosaur was chasing the guy, or the dinosaur walked through and then later the guy walked through, or the guy walked through and later the dinosaur walked through.
Is it possible that they could have that a human could have laid down the sediment and then made an impression of like a dinosaur foot like that?
Nope, because there would be two different layers of rock though. You're talking two different types of sediment. It's all one homogeneous piece of rock, which means all one sediment. So we have a lot of examples like this. You can go to Answers in Genesis or Creation.org online and look up lots of stuff like this. And again, like Bible even clearly states that we lived alongside of dinosaurs. Like Job, which is the oldest book in the Bible, first one recorded and written, it refers to animals like Leviathan that would have been living alongside of humans. Okay? So, now let's talk about the flaws in the actual theory. Okay, so this should be the giraffes. Yeah, okay, so this is an image that used to appear in science. Alright. And so natural selection in action. So you have two different types of giraffes. You have long-necked giraffes and short-necked giraffes. Long-necked giraffes, they eat from the leaves. Short-necked giraffes, they're too short and stubby to reach the leaves. And apparently they're also dumb because they don't find any bushes or grass or anything like that. They're super picky and they only eat the leaves. Okay? So, what happens? The long necks keep eating from the leaves and they never share with their short neck friends. And so the short necks die off. And so this proves that long necked giraffes are heartless creatures. Okay? So essentially what happens is you start with, it's a survival of the fittest kind of concept, okay? You start with multiple species, the one that is most fit survives and outcompetes the other species, and on and on and on the process goes. So, let's think about this. Evolution says you get more species as time goes on. But part of their theory is natural selection, survival of the fittest. We started with how many giraffes?
Two.
Two types. There's three in the picture, but there's two types. Now we've got how many types?
One.
That's the opposite direction, isn't it? Started with multiple types, now we got one. So we're supposed to start with one and go two or three or whatever. It can work that way. So they would say that you start with one type of giraffe, then you get two types of giraffe. The second type is stronger than the second type of giraffe, or the first type, so then they outcompete and the first type dies off. Now you're left with just one. Well, then that repeats itself and repeats itself. Okay, so how do we get new giraffes? Mutation. Now, there is two actual types of evolution. There's micro, adaptation, and macro. Macro is the large, where you change from one species to a new species. Okay? Micro is actually totally possible. We watch it all the time. Christians even affirm microevolution, where different things have happened, where this species looks slightly different. Same species can actually interbreed with this species, but this species is from a different continent, but they're both the same bird, the same animal, the same whatever, right? But they look slightly different. That's called adaptation. We do it with dogs, like intentionally. How many dogs do you think there were originally?
One.
Probably just one. But they've bred them for their different like sizes, abilities, hair, whatever it may be. Yeah. So now you got the new hypoallergenic, like golden doodle hybrid thingy, right? Okay. So like It's just all together, right? We intentionally do this. This is called adaptation, but it's still a dog. All right, going from a dog to something else entirely, that would be macro evolution. Okay? We don't affirm macro, we affirm micro. That's called adaptation. Okay? So, in order to go from macro, one species to another, it requires a mutation. Do you know that we have no evidence of one mutation from one species to another? Now, we do actually have evidence of mutations, but none of them are beneficials for that species. It's when the genome of that species was altered ever so slightly, and then that became a problem for that species. It was never in the positive, it was always in the negative. So, if we have no mutations to get from one species to the next, and natural selection doesn't work because you didn't start with one and end up with two, you're actually going from two and now to one, we're actually losing species. Extinction is a lot more real than evolution is. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Alright, so now let's go back to good old Darwin, 1869. He says, hey, this is my theory, and if my theory is any good, the fossil record will prove it. Okay? So, problem with that is he didn't have a whole lot of fossils. Like, we've got a ton of fossils now, right at 200 years later, but he had very few. So his theory was like, hey, this is my theory out there, and I think as we find more fossils, we're going to be able to prove this. We haven't proven it yet. But it became a very money-making, wealthy kind of thing to do that. So people tried to prove it. They tried to find what was called the missing link. You ever heard that phrase? All right, so what they're trying to find is the missing link from the ape to man. All right, can you show that slide? Is it already up there? Amazing. All right, so here you have humanity on the right, you have the apes, and then the idea is that slowly you would find all these species too. And so different people started finding these different species in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because if they found it, they would be world famous as the person who proved evolution was correct. So there are a bunch of different types of humans. Let's talk about the human evolutional people. All right, the most popular is the Neanderthal. That's the one that's in all our museums, right? They apparently lived 2 million years ago. They were first found in Neander Valley in Germany, in Neanderthal. Their characteristic is they're robust, bigger than humans, stooped shoulders, low brow, and bow-legged. About 30 years ago, actually when I did this research, probably now 40 years ago, they discovered that Neanderthals are actually fully human. They're Homo sapiens. Genetically identical to humanity. They all suffered from a disease called rickets. Rickets is a dietary disease. It's a disorder caused by a lack of vitamin D, calcium, or phosphate, and it leads to the softening or weakening of bones. It was actually really funny in the first hour. Miss Faye Koffler was in here. She is a retired nurse, and so as soon as I said rickets, she's like, "Oh yeah," and she just starts listing out all these things. Like, one of the big things is you end up with a sloped brow because your bones get soft, and the gravity working on your bones, it actually pulls your forehead down. It pulls your cheekbones down. It pulls your shoulder bones down, and then the whole weight on your legs make them bow-legged. So these Neanderthals really are humans, fully human. They just had really bad diets. All right, so that's the first one, the most popular one. Yes.
Okay, so if apes become human, then why are we still apes?
Ooh, don't go that far. You're getting ahead of me. All right, so Piltdown Man, discovered in 1912 by a guy named Charles Dawson. 1953, it's reevaluated by a guy named Kenneth Oakley from the British Museum. He's a geologist. And Joseph Weiner from Oxford University. He was an anthropologist. They discovered that it was a fully human skull, so a human skull, and an orangutan jaw.
That's
What?
so
Made the jaw come out further, made it look a little bit less human, and the orangutan teeth had been filed down. very well, because not until 1953 did they have the technology to even discover, oh, it's a fake, but this guy got a lot of money on it. Then you have the Nebraska Man. 1 million years ago, 1922, farmer found in Nebraska, found a tooth. Took it to the scientists, said it was the half-man ape.
So
Okay.
he like came up with us.
Then an artist drew a picture to go along with the tooth. It's called an artist's rendition. I see this in science all the time, especially when it comes to evolution. Because again, think of it like as Jurassic Park, Jurassic World. Does anybody know what a dinosaur looked like?
Nope. You've only got the bones. You can't tell the structure of the skin.
The skin, we have no idea. We can guess. That's all we got. So anything in the movies, anything like that, is always called an artist's rendition. So an artist does a rendition of this Nebraska Man. 1925, only 3 years later, is discovered to be a tooth of an extinct Paraguayan pig. Pig tooth. All right, so Java Man, 750,000 years ago, discovered by Eugene Dubois. He was digging in Indonesia, hence Java Man. Okay, found fragments of a skull, thigh, and teeth. Later, he confessed that the fragments were found in separate locations, and all three are been proven to be an ape. So not human at all. Okay? Ramapithecus, 1940, found in India. Later identified as a extinct species of orangutan. Cro-Magnon, rickets. Fully human, just had rickets. Last one, the most important, the most sought after, this one's in all the museums of natural history. Australopithecus, also known as Lucy. Have you ever seen in evolutionary books or anything like that? It's a skeleton, and they refer to her because of her pelvic structure. Women and men have slightly different pelvic structures. Okay, it was discovered that it was a woman's skeleton, so they named her Lucy. She is known as the Australopithecus, the missing link. 1973, Donald Johanson discovered her. This is the most recent. 1990, admitted the skeleton was found in 2 different layers and 2 different locations. So he found half this body over here, like miles away, found the other half of the body at different depths in different layers.
So basically like piecing together a skeleton.
Yep. And saying, I found the missing link. But this is what you guys may be hearing, taught, anything like that, as to this is legit. So now we know that there are no gaps in the fossil record. Or sorry, let me rephrase that. There's nothing but gaps. They didn't find the gaps. They didn't find the parts that connect this species to this species. Like, all we got, like what your question was, we got the chimpanzee, and we got humans, and we don't have any of these.
Just from one to other, we don't have any proof of the middle.
So here's the 2 solutions they have. Spontaneous evolution. The lack of evidence is the evidence.
That
So-
makes no
So stupid.
sense. Like, are they like?
So they're serious about it. So here's what they're saying. Here's what they're saying. Somewhere along the line of history or something like that, some sort of cataclysmic event came around, maybe it was radiation, something like that, and it caused everything within a generation immediately to evolve very rapidly from one species to another species. In other words, the new species appeared on the planet.
That is so stupid.
It's not, actually, it's quite brilliant. It's the story we tell. One day there was this species, the next day there was another species. So, what they now say is, so then something happened and everything evolved rapidly. The problem with that, how then do you have this animal and this animal? So here's their solution. The chimpanzee is a fully evolved version of the chimpanzee. If the chimpanzee evolves, it will evolve into some other type of chimpanzee, something like that, but it will not evolve into human. Only humans have evolved into humans. So here's what they're saying. Evolution no longer works. because we've not had any sort of cataclysmic event that propelled evolution down the road. So if it no longer works, doesn't work anymore, maybe it never worked in the first place.
Yeah.
And again, my job is not necessarily today to prove that Christianity is right. But again, I was just saying it, like, we believe that in the beginning God spoke. And when he spoke, species appeared on certain days according to their types. It's very clear. And every day, like I was talking about the trees, he made trees according to their type that then bore fruit according to their type. You get apples from an apple tree. You don't get oranges off of it, okay? And so everything continues on in its type. We affirm everything about adaptation. We affirm even in chapter 10 of Genesis, the table of nations, where certain ethnicities started going in different directions based upon their adaptations. Some could handle the cold better, some could handle the heat better, and they went according to their genetic makeup. That's how you have certain ethnicities that come from different areas in the world, because that genetic information that started with two people, originally Adam and Eve, then you get to the flood, wiped out except for two people again, so Noah and his wife, two people. From that, two people, all the genetic information then came out to everybody, and then this person with this genetic information went over here, this person with this genetic information went over there, and another one down here. And from that person's genetic information came the races and the ethnicities that we find in that region. We totally affirm that as Christians. Moreover, now science actually affirms it as well, because within just the last 10 years, through, you've heard of the genome, human genome, where they've mapped out all the genes in the human DNA, they can now prove that all humans are descended from two. Which we're all like, yep, we're there. And it's actually really funny, in this article they refer back to a statement from a theologian that all the scientists who have been scrambling for hundreds of years to climb the mountain to find God, they get to the top of the mountain to finally find out how the origin of species actually happened, only to find a bunch of pastors and theologians have been there for thousands of years. It's very frustrating to find out that when God spoke, that's what happened. So again, I'm not trying to say that this is necessarily the right one, even though I think the evidence tends to lean our direction more. But what I do know is that their theory is not a very good theory.
Although didn't he end up denying the theory of evolution?
We don't really know. So there is a story that on his deathbed, or within the last few months to weeks of his death, that Charles Darwin not necessarily recanted his theory of evolution, just more or less said that it's not true. Because when he first proposed the theory, he just proposed it as a theory. It then kind of took off as like almost a religious following. There were other people who were more atheist, had a issue with God, and so they used his as a reason to support why there is no God. Does it make sense? Because now we don't need God if this happened. Now again, I'm not saying that you have to believe young earth creationism in order to be a Christian. It's Jesus plus nothing equals salvation, okay? So if you simply believe in Christ, that he paid for your sins and that he has forgiven you those sins, that's all you need. You don't have to believe that there's a young earth. You can believe in evolution and in Jesus. But if you don't believe in the gospel, or not the gospel, the biblical account in Genesis for the origin of the world, it just makes things more complicated.
I feel like their way makes it more complicated.
Well, no, I mean, like, as a Christian, it makes it more complicated. Like, if we're going to have an argument of whether God intended people to be homosexual or not, well, if he made a man and a woman at the beginning and that's it, that definitely serves as a foundation. Because even Jesus refers back to the man and the woman. He says, do you not know that in the beginning God made them man and woman? He specifically stated that we're in referring to the doctrine of marriage. That's even where we get our doctrine of marriage. It's chapter 2 of Genesis. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if you don't affirm the biblical account, it just makes a lot of other things more complicated. But you can still live as a Christian without affirming it, okay? But what I really want you guys to understand is that the theory of evolution is not a reason to believe there is no God and that Christianity is a lie. Because there's a lot of other Christians that do feel that.